All right. Hello, everyone. This is a brand new thing. We are doing something we've never done before. This is so exciting. I'm excited to be here. Avi's excited to be here. And look, we have Bruce, who has never been on this show because this show's brand new. No one knows what this is. That's right. This is a special director's cut, the director's cut of conference talks. Yeah, I had this idea, and I was talking about it at FOSDEM the other week, and Bruce just happened to be in the room with me, and I go, Bruce, what do you think of this? And Bruce is like, I kind of like it. I did that once, and it was kind of cool. And I'm like, you want to come on and do this? And he's like, yeah. And what is the idea? What we're going to do is we're going to take some of the best conference talks that we've seen, but we're going to do a director's cut where we have a couple of folks on the presentation asking questions and diving into things as we go. It's not going to be a classic presentation. It's going to be the director's cut so we can get into the minds of those who are presenting. And so that's why we're here with Bruce. Bruce, welcome to the director's cut of your talk.
Great. So the reason I was excited is that I have done some talks with multiple speakers, and I've always found those to be better than me speaking alone, just talking and talking and talking. I guess what I say is interesting, but having other people to bounce stuff off of and to say good idea, bad idea, or how about this, I think makes a more interesting talk, and I think you get a lot more out of it.
That's what we're hoping for. So I did not get a chance to see building open source teams this year. I've seen it a couple of years ago. I think you gave it at a different conference that I was at, but I didn't see it at FOSDEM, and I'm like, oh, I wanted to go. So here you are to give building open source teams to us. Take it away, Bruce.
Great, thank you. Yeah, this is an interesting topic, and it's something that I know you have sort of struggled with as well, Matt. It's how do you build teams? How do you kind of create an environment where open source people are valued? How do you create an environment where people think it's a good investment of their time to be part of this? And you would think it would be something people would talk about all the time because it's so important, particularly in the open source world, but it almost is never talked about. And I got a chance when I was at the FOSDEM to kind of hang out in the community room a little bit, and you see little glimpses of it. You see like very narrow, hey, how do we improve this little thing about our community or that little thing? But I don't see a lot of people taking a real sort of holistic view of what are we doing, why are we doing it, what motivates people, how do we sort of get them at their sweet spot, how do we minimize some of the deficiencies they might have, and I think that's sort of a hallmark of how you create a really successful team.
And when we're talking about team here, Bruce, we're talking not just about like a team at your company. We're talking about a community team. We're talking about, like a team that's working towards a common goal, who could be working for multiple companies.
Yeah. And it's funny. I watched Zero Dark 30 a couple of weeks ago. It was about the attack on the launch against Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, and I've done some research in sort of how those SEAL teams are arranged and so forth. And it's sort of a similar thing. You have a very specialized team and everyone has specific skills, right? In kind of walking in there, everyone's not cookie cutter, and they have to sort of work together. And there's a huge amount of training going on. And we're not doing anything at that scale, right? But the point is that everyone's not the same, right? Everyone has different skills. Everyone has different motivations technically, in open source. Like usually in businesses, the assumption is you pay somebody, they do the work, and you assume sort of a uniform motivation. In fact, that's actually not true. There's a lot of people we know who work at because they like what they're doing, and they like their coworkers. They like the type of business that is in, or the type of work they do, or the reliability, or so there's a lot of things. It's a lot more complicated. And open source, because we don't hire anybody, right? Obviously, there's a huge spectrum of motivations, and to really talk about that helps you to be successful.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, especially with all the diverse personalities, and you mentioned like the movie 0 Dark 30, where you have a military team that's trained for years and years and years,
Yeah.
or if you have a soccer team, or baseball, whatever, they train. Now it's just like sometimes in the open source space, it's just throwing people together, and they have no context for working with one another.
That is a great point because you meet people you don't even know what they look like, right? I mean, we had a guy named Jan early in our project, and we're like, and we're talking to her, we think, and sort of interacting, and the person's really doing some great work and whatever. And all of a sudden, I get a phone call. And in the early years, I did a lot of phone calling to sort of motivate people. And guy starts talking to me. He says, "Hi, my name's Jan." And I'm like, and I'm trying to shift my gears. Like, is this Jan? I think it is. I have to sort of tell everybody sort of behind the scenes. This Jan we thought was a woman was actually Jan, a man out of Germany. We're like, we got our first woman. Like, no, we don't actually. We're still just the guys. But yeah, so it's kind of funny. Yeah, there's so much behind these people, and a lot of what motivates, I think, our project is getting behind there and really showing that we do care about the people who are part of our project.
Yeah. All right.
So let me get started here. Let's
Absolutely.
So I've been working with Postgres obviously since 1996. I think the call with Jan was probably in '97. In those early years, we had a very small team. Obviously, Postgres was not what it is today. I worked for 3 different companies. One of them based in Japan. For 5 years. I'm with EDB. I've been with them for 16 years now. And yeah, it's been a very surprising ride. I didn't really realize what I was getting into when I started. I'm certainly happy I did, but you don't know. In fact, sometimes I talk to people and they're like, "Well, how did you get into this?" And I'm like, I said, there's certain days that this is going to be an important day. Like, okay, I'm getting married, or I'm graduating from college or high school or whatever. But my involvement with Postgres didn't have this momentous, hey, this is going to be a huge change to your life.
You fell into it, basically.
Yeah,
right?
I fell into it. I hid how much time I spent for my wife for many years. She used to come down with a little report I was a consultant, and she'd say, you're a little low on the hours this month. And I'm like, yeah, we had a big Postgres release. There were some bugs.
No.
She would have snagged me. Yeah, and I'm like, and she'd say, why don't you spend more time with your family instead of this Postgres thing? And I'm like, there's no answer to that. I'm like, I don't know. I said, she wanted me to get a doctorate in computer science. I said, the people I'm working with are actually really smart, and I'm learning a lot of new stuff. That was actually one of my motivations I'll talk about in a minute. So I was like, oh, well, okay. Well, she said, maybe that, okay, he's not getting a doctorate, but he's at least learning to be more, his skill set, is advancing. Because at that point, I'd been writing legal law firm financial reports for 7 years. So, in terms of like technology growth, I was near zero, right? So
yeah, that's got to be daunting. That's you need the escape. You need the escape somewhere.
Postgres was the escape. I said, someday maybe the skills I learn will be useful, right? Like, I don't know, So this is an open source project that you have very few users. There's no money. There's no, we're not selling anything. But yeah, it was kind of surprising. But again, that was one of my, what we're going to talk about actually in this talk is one motivation, which I've kind of outlined a little bit already, at least for me. Then we're going to talk about some of the sort of nuts and bolts of open source management. In other words, what things you need to do to kind of make it happen. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit more about the development process.
Before you move on to Bruce, because I like to just ask random questions. On the previous slide, you talked about how you had started, or worked at 3 different companies in a management space. I'm curious as to the structure of the Postgres team versus your management teams that you've had to manage. Are there any similarities or differences?
So I'll give you there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer.
There's always a short and long answer, Bruce.
Yeah,
that's true about anything.
No, but this one is super short. I never manage anybody in the companies I work for.
Okay.
So, and again, having traveled as much as I do, and I'm sure you understand, like it would be impossible for me to travel at the level I do, 90 days a year, and work on the community, what I think is necessary, and actually manage people. So I've never had direct reports. I've always been I feel like an R&D guy or somebody just kind of floats out in the community and keeps it healthy while everyone else kind of goes and worries about customers and so forth. Yeah, I go to customers once in a while. I go to, I go to conferences. We do stuff with the customers, but it's almost always a one-off ad hoc thing. So I've never had to manage people. I probably could, but it's kind of gotten to the point where it's just really not, given what the demands of my time, it's probably not a good use of my time.
Hey, you have an entire community to manage and to foster and to build relationships.
So one of the things
you have thousands of people who work with you.
Right. So one of the issues actually that relates to that is that having been in that responsible position and not having really had any management experience, I realized that I needed to invest in my own management skills. So, for example, this morning, I attended something called Global Leadership Summit, which happens once or twice a year. And it's basically a day or half a day or 2 days of leadership training. I also go to something called LeaderCast, which is another big event that happens once a year. And through that, I kind of learn how to be a better leader, but also get terms, or I'm able to verbalize leadership better than just knowing what to do but not having the words for it. So, for example, you were talking about leadership style, and there's probably 7 different types of leaders. Like there's the innovative leader, there's the charismatic leader, there's organizational leader. And one of the key types I think is really important is open source is what we call the servant leader. Now, the servant leader is a type of leader you see a lot in the hospitality industry, in industries that have a lot of customer support, customer interaction. And the concept of a servant leader is that you're there to serve your employees so they can serve their customers, right? You can't mistreat your employees and expect them to treat customers well. It doesn't work that way, right? If you're selling Apple iPhones, you can probably do that, right? Because
ouch!
Absolutely, though. Let's dunk on Apple. They deserve
or
it.
something that, if you're selling washing machines or cars, you don't have there's not a lot of customer interaction, right? But obviously you think of a hospitality industry, that's going to be a case where, and one of the case studies was Marriott. One of the reasons Marriott, I think, has taken over the hospitality industry in a big way in the past 10 years is that they had that concept down of being servants to their employees and allowing their employees to then be servants to the customers in a way that I don't see some of the other hospitality industry do it. Why is that important? Because effectively, when you're leading something like an open source project or a volunteer organization, the concept of being those other type of leaders really doesn't work, I would say. I have a tendency to be more on the servant leader side just personally. I think it's one of the more effective styles, and I think business has sort of borne that out if you look at successful leaders. But in the open source space, that is almost a requirement.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And when you see leaders who don't have that underpinning of how they do leadership, and I'm not going to name any names here, you see the costs. You see the lack of cohesion within the organization. You see the sort of dysfunction. You see that the organization really doesn't flourish the way it should. It may still flourish. it may be in a market to the extent that even if they do all sorts of crazy stuff, it still flourishes. But is it flourishing the way it should? And I would argue that it probably isn't.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting.
I think it's very interesting, Bruce. You're right.
Extremely so.
So this slide's kind of interesting. I talked about motivation, and I would say if you don't understand what motivates your volunteers, you're really not going to attract and retain volunteers in a crowd. Yeah, you might kind of like luckily kind of do it, but for me it helped to kind of write down exactly what are the motivations. This is not new stuff. This is from 2002, sort of when open source was just started to bloom, and it's basically a survey that was done, and it basically outlines 4 or 5 different motivations for people getting involved in open source. And I think the shocker to me is that if you ask any individual which one of these things motivated you, they really wouldn't be able to tell you. Because,
Yeah, I mean, that is a tough one. I mean, out of the 4,
yeah,
I mean, and I think that there's some things that have come up new that fall into these, but people maybe don't necessarily point back to it, right? So right now, there's an expectation no matter what job you have now, it's almost a certainty that there's going to be some involvement in open source, whether you like it or not. So you're sometimes dragged along, that path. But I also think that from an open source perspective, there's a lot of people who are looking to break into the industry, get something new. But I think it's for them sometimes not necessarily learning new skills, but oftentimes like trying to maybe get a better job or position themselves better in the market.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of all over the place. Like you could look at, like, even for me, right? Like what things motivated me, and I would say it was mostly mental stimulation because, again, I said I had been working for so long, doing mundane work, and I didn't feel I was gaining new skills, and in engineering, if you're not really gaining new skills, you're falling behind, right? So that was probably my number one. But then, I also, as I said earlier, there was a chance maybe there'll be value in this someday. Like maybe the skills I learn will have some kind of return. I don't know what that is, but they might. And the second one, I didn't really ever use the software. Even now, I've never been a Postgres user. That I've never stored.
Whoa!
Never?
Never?
No.
That's crazy. Oh my goodness. Wow.
No. Now, when I started, I was using Informix and Ingress. So I actually used similar databases. And one of the things that got me involved was curiosity. Like, how does Informix Optimizer work? How does Ingress Optimizer work? And maybe I couldn't see their optimizers, but I could see the Postgres Optimizer. And that kind of got me curious. Like, oh, wow, I'm now learning. I was writing database applications, but now I can see what's happening inside the database and kind of.
Wow.
So that to me was exciting.
Yeah, that's rare. I mean, honestly, Bruce, that's rare because most people that I know have actually used the software before they even decide to, like, I want to contribute, or yeah. In my experience, yeah.
I think that the practical need one, I think in any projects I've run, people show up because they want to, like, they are using it specifically, and that's what gets them hooked for the first time. But as an aside, I have never not used Postgres in a project.
Oh, look at you! Like you throw it. Like I am wearing the Postgres hat. There's a lot of Postgres love here, so we're fine.
Yeah,
we're fine.
we love it. Yeah.
By the way, Ami, why did you first do open source?
I think really it was because I was building I was building something that I I was wanting or needing, and I just wanted to share it, basically.
The
and it was just
practical.
kind of the obvious way to share it. Yeah. And then, I just got kind of just incrementally more hooked on it. Like once I got to like work with random people on the other side of the world, that was just cool. And so there was kind of a fun social side to it. But when I look at this, these bullet points here, I kind of just see, I feel like there's probably a lot of other people like this. There's like a little bit of everything here for me. Like, it was definitely just fun and interesting. I was building in, new languages that I wasn't super familiar with. And, obviously I just thought that that's a nice, open source is great. Why wouldn't I want to be a part of that? So I bet that's why a lot of people don't really know or can't necessarily pin it down to one, would be my guess.
And what's interesting, if you think of how people do a job, like an employed job, right? Usually like, okay, yeah, I got to go to the office 9 to 5, but I get this money. So it's pretty clear sometimes, like what's motivating people to do stuff, because it's often okay, I'm sacrificing this and I'm getting this, right? There's usually that kind of a trade-off. But in open source, it's kind of like, it feels like everything's going in the same direction, and you don't have that kind of trade-off too much, and you don't have a case where you're thinking, oh, well, I had to give up that to do this other thing, and therefore, so that's why I think it's hard for people to kind of identify what it is that drives them. And this is actually a good thing, because over time, I think, as you were saying, Avi, like one thing gets them in, and then this other thing kind of creeps up, and they don't really have to make a decision as they're going, right? There's not this inflection point that they have to say, which road am I going on? It just kind of rolls them forward. They get involved with this, and then they start to interact with an email list, and then they show up at a meetup, and then a conference, and then they get responsibility, and then they're committed. So it's a very unusual kind of flow that I think is pretty important to the success of projects like that.
Yeah. The other thing that comes to mind for me when looking at these is it struck me that mental stimulation and learning new skills are like almost identical. Like they're not exactly the same, but it's hard for me to think of ways where you'd be mentally stimulated while not also learning.
Well, I think it's the point is that the goal. So there's a bunch of people who are mental stimulation is a goal in itself, and I'll show you that on the next slide. Whereas learning new skills really has a practical value to it.
Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah. In fact, I'll just show you the next slide. So this is actually from even an older book in the 70s called The Mythical Man Month, and it talks about programming being this tractable medium, that you can modify with zero cost effectively. And it kind of describes it as sort of a complex puzzle, and you're making useful things, and you're making things, and you're learning stuff. So it's this sort of a I don't want to say a game, but a hobby or a pastime of sort of manipulating stuff that I think is also one of the values, and makes open source kind of unique in that space. Yes, there's some projects that do other things, hardware stuff and whatever, but in terms of size of global organizations that kind of work on collectively on something, open source is kind of this somewhat unique piece. The other one I can think of are like global charities, or gee whiz, I'm not sure what else there is that's that scale of maybe like shortwave radio, but that's usually
there's a lot of ham radio operators. What's weird is they generally show up at all the Linux conferences.
Right.
So, overlapping for sure.
Exactly right. Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, the maker community, like when you talk about like maker, in terms of hardware or gadgets, as you well know, home automation guru that you are, there's quite a bit of overlap between those communities.
But it feels like and I'm thinking of the ham radio group, it feels like the zero cost of interaction is part of the sort of oil that allows for that seamless. Uh, I'm thinking of like the Burning Man conference, right, which is something in Southwest. Um, that's really not. It has a feel of an open source project, but it's really very, I would assume, very commercial because everyone's got to fly in there for this, and I don't know what happens when you're there. I've never been to it, but um, it's the rigidity of requiring everyone to go to a single place, and the cost there, and then they have to live somewhere, they have to eat, right? I mean, there's all these logistics that force a top-down kind of structure on the process, where I feel like open source doesn't really have that because of that sort of cost-free communication model. And the only other thing I can think of similar to this would be the sort of floppy disk shareware thing that was around.
Oh wow, going old school.
Around in
going way old school.
Right.
We're pulling out some Doom discs
too young
and
for
some.
that.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yes, I know.
But Bruce, by the way, on Burning Man, what happens there? They could tell you, but then they'd have to kill you.
Right. That's what I've heard. Yes. Yeah. There's that sort of aura to that event. So down to the communication issue, that ability to communicate at no cost is really what made it possible. Before it was you'd have to copy DVDs, what am I saying? Floppy disk, and then you send it to somebody. But as soon as the internet made that communication free, then obviously as I said, the case where you come to a decision, you have to go left or right. Am I going to invest and go to Burning Man? Am I going to invest and buy this piece of equipment? Or am I going to? And that inflection point where you have to make a decision doesn't exist, so people can kind of slide in a very smooth way at no cost. And I think that's sort of fundamental to it. But then once you actually, as a leader, once you've got all these people together, then you got a challenge, right? Because to really make the most of it, you as a leader, your idea of traveling to visit these people is very important. Obviously, you're communicating with people in different time zones. There was a case where when I was working on the Windows port for Postgres, I had a guy in Sweden and another one in Australia. So I'd get up in the morning and I'd work with the guy in Sweden because he liked to work at his evening time. And then in the middle of the day it would be kind of quiet. And then at night I would work with the guy in Australia because he liked to work in his morning. So my day was kind of split.
You sleep during the day. You're working.
Yeah,
you're working
right,
like third
exactly,
shift.
Exactly. That was sort of a challenge. Obviously, there's different cultures. They're different. They do things differently, just the way it is. And you can't impose your culture necessarily on what happens in other cultures. We have issues where things that are acceptable in some culture are not acceptable in others, and you have to kind of roll with that. Obviously, language is a huge issue, and we have language specific, like email lists and stuff, but it's hard.
Yeah, I think that overcoming the language barrier is challenging, but it's a must. I think that the cultural barriers are also there. When you do start to meet people in person, you get to pick up those things, especially when you travel to those locations. Yeah. Right? Nowhere does that kind of cultural difference show more than in like food, right? Because there are certain places that you go, and there are things that I've eaten that I would have never eaten in the U.S.
Yeah. I pretty much eat anything. And when I used to take my kids a lot on trips, I would basically say, you don't have to finish everything, but you got to try everything. And then
Good
I would
policy.
look when they tried it, and if they kind of had that look on their face, I would figure out a way of getting some food over to them that would be more palatable. But that actually worked out really well. I mean, to the point where my son went to Japan with me. We had sushi. He liked it. Came home. He said, "Where do you want to go for your birthday?" He wants to go to a Japanese restaurant. We have one right near here, and he orders sushi, and he gives my wife some to try. And my wife's like, "Oh, I don't want to try that." He's like, "No, you gotta try it." I had to try it. So he really got her, and she loves sushi now, right?
Well,
so
there you go. Right?
There
it
you
was
go.
the kind
Yeah,
of
that's
thing
awesome.
where, we never would have known that. Yeah, it's just weird that kind of stuff happens. Yeah. So let me walk into these individual items a little more detail. So communication. Obviously, emails are a major one. We're old school in that way. As I said before, I used to call people a lot. So one of the guys said, for outreach, we just need Bruce with a phone, because I used to call just people,
We're going to get your T-shirt, Bruce with a phone.
Yeah, Bruce with a phone. I do a lot of instant messaging now. So I have most of our community members are on some instant message. I actually am using Pigeon because I can have the Telegram folks and the Skype folks and the Google folks all kind of together, and the IRC folks all in one bucket, because different geos, like Telegram's big in Russia and Skype seems to be big in Asia, and Google's more the US, and IRC's kind of Europe. So it's kind of all over. But I find that is really, really helpful.
I think a lot of people now are doing the Slack or the Discord for their kind of like messages, and if you're going to go direct, Signal's popular, WhatsApp.
Yeah.
So I think depending on the open source community you're joining, if they've been established for a long time, they've got IRC. They're kind of stuck in it. Anybody who's on IRC hates to leave IRC, but those who haven't started there loathe it. So it's a weird.
I can't
thing.
stand it personally.
See, I told you.
It's where's the history? Like what? I can't.
Yeah. So we basically meet people where they are. At least I do. Whatever they're on. That's the nice thing about Pigeon is you can have them all. Mm-hmm. So I can see one of my people, and I can see all of I can see their Telegram, and I can see their Google, and I can see their IRC all together. And when I click on their name, it should pick the most recently active chat client that they are using. So if they were last using Telegram, it will pick Telegram. If they're last using Gmail, it'll pick Gmail. So that way, I don't even have to think of what they're on. I can't say we have a standard for our community. We have an IRC channel. We have a Slack channel, but in terms of individual communication, it's all kind of around. Telegram's gotten a lot bigger, I would say. That's my sort of the growing one. Skype is certainly shrinking, and IRC is still around. Conferences is interesting for me. I went to a conference, big open source conference I went was OSCon in San Diego. So that would have been 2001, maybe 2099, 98. I don't remember what it was. Maybe it was in 2000. And I flew out there, gave 2 talks. I think one was a tutorial, one was maybe I spoke to 70 people. And I'm flying home, and I'm like, well, that was a waste of time. Maybe I spoke to 70 people, right?
Right.
Is that a good use of my time? I mean, when I send an email, I speak to thousands of people. Anyway, so I come home and we're not doing this again. It was good, but I don't think it's going to happen. So what's really weird is the next week on the email list, there's a lot of activity. All of a sudden, this is early on. I can tell right away. There's a lot more activity than usual. And I after about a week, start to look at the names of the people who are more active than before. And I realized these are the people I had lunch with at the conference. I don't even know if they attended my talk, but they're people I sat and had lunch with, and I talked about what I was doing, and I showed interest in what they were doing and whatever. And I was like, oh, well, I guess sending an email to 1,000 people and actually going visiting people is a different experience. So that's why I kind of got on the conference bandwagon. I think I've traveled, I don't know, 1,200 days or something like that. It's about 90 days a year. So I've been doing it for, I guess, 12 years. It's about 1,200, whatever.
So I think the good
Wow.
point there is, like, open source is such a relationship thing. People want to help people, not necessarily just
Yeah.
nameless projects.
Yeah.
And if they get to know you and the other people as part of the project, they'll want to help.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the big thing. So yeah, I travel up until December. It was 1,358 days and 213 trips. So it's about 4 years, I guess, of sort of schlepping around. But you're right. That personal touch was very important. And one of the things I learned, for example, is I basically go to spend time with the people. I don't necessarily talk to them about the software at all. We just kind of hang out, and I often stay an extra day. If I go to a conference like I'll stay an extra day, and somebody will be there who stayed, who wants to sightsee, or one of the locals. And a lot of times that's like the most interesting part of the whole conference, right? Because you're spending time with them. You're going up to the mountains, you're going to the forest, whatever they want to do, that's what you're going to do. And they live there, or they typically know the area better than I do, so it's always really interesting. But I found that is actually a huge win for people, is going to their location, spending time, not being rushed, and just kind of whatever happens. Because it's email's nice, but as we saw during the pandemic, it's not, virtual's not still virtual.
Yeah, just really no substitute for the face-to-face kind of discussions. It's so much more information rich, I guess. And yeah, in the pandemic, people were really talking, it overemphasized all the the benefits of async work, and we talk about that in open source a lot. But I mean, there's a reason you're traveling so much. There's just not really any way to just no substitute.
Yeah, what I found, in fact, I even had a case today where our developers, for example, in Russia years ago, were not. We weren't getting the fixes to the patches. We had a bunch of features that had been developed by Russians, but we didn't have. We weren't getting the fixes that we needed for So we'd roll out a feature, but then there were things that needed to be fixed, and we were having trouble. So I went to my boss and said, I think I need to develop closer relationships. I need to invest in Russia as a community, and I think that will turn things around, and it did. It was pretty surprising after a year or so, 2 years of traveling there. By investing in their culture and spending time with them, they saw the value of maintaining regular contact with the community, and sort of and they've since created big companies around it. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on, but that's true across the board, whether it's China, Japan, or Sri Lanka, or Brazil, or whatever. That travel is pretty important.
Okay. By the way, Bruce, just an FYI, Avi's going to drop off in about 10 minutes, but I'll still be here, so don't feel bad.
Sure.
If he drops. It's not because of you.
Yeah, no, I just have.
It's not because of you or the discussion.
Half hour, but this is great. So I'm really enjoying this.
Sure. So yeah, travel can be expensive. Fortunately, my employer's always funded that. So, it is kind of hard. And I shared you. I have a specific criteria I use on deciding when to go to conferences. A lot of big conferences, my attendance is required. A lot of small conferences, my attendance is helpful. And then sort of the medium-sized conferences are a little harder to identify. Is it near another conference? Is it near me or in Philadelphia, right? Sort of you look at distances, and that's how you kind of filter where you're going to go. Yeah, it's kind of a sacrifice for my family. I've kind of gotten away with it because I've been able to take my kids with me on a lot of travels. They've usually been to about 20 countries by the time they graduate high school. So that because they know that they can come with me, that makes a big difference in how they view that time. They're like, oh, maybe I'm not going with it this time, but I can go next time. So it's not seen as a negative. I guess it's similar to what we talked about, Avi, that you could basically say, Dad needs to travel, and you're just going to have to take the cost, right? But if you kind of bring them along on that journey and you let them see it as a positive as well, then they don't really see it as an either or thing that's sort of hurting them. But you have to be very conscious of it. You have to reinvest when you get home, and not take on a bunch of stuff when you're getting back, and kind of hang out for a couple of days and sort of ease into and show up at stuff that normally you'd never go to, but because you're home, you're going. And similar when I travel and I go to other cities or countries, I visit relatives, I visit somebody because may not be around when something bad happens. Yeah, but I'm here now, so I'm going to visit you and spend time with you. So you have to be very mindful of what you're doing. Again, time zones, as I said, very hard to figure out. The cell phone helps because now you can get messages kind of in the middle, and you can kind of text people when they have a question. But it is a 24-hour process. So yeah, you get up in the morning, and Europe's halfway through their day, and you got to catch up. And the morning is the hardest for me because there is so much sort of queued up that people are like waiting.
Yeah, what I've found effective here is I will typically, when I've got a global team, I will set aside one day a week where it's like I'm going to wake up and start at 4 a.m. And then there's another day where I will be around till like 10 or 11.
Wow.
Right. And so I pick a day a week. Right.
Okay.
So that way I can be like Tuesday is my early morning day. And so if you're in those times that are early morning, Tuesday, you can reach me. Thursday's I'm going to sleep in, so don't bother me in the morning. And I'm going to stay up till I'll be available for meetings until like 10 or 11. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's how I've done it. I know other people have different strategies for that, but I think people who you go meet in their time zones appreciate it more. Right. I think as American run companies typically require people to work their off hours. So you don't see those external folks having to work those weird hours. So when you do the exact same thing they appreciate it.
Yeah, for me, I don't think most of my interactions asynchronous. So there's very rarely is somebody actually sort of stuck waiting for me. It's just that there's a bigger volume in the morning. That first 2 hours, there's a bigger volume of stuff going on, and then it kind of tapers off. But nothing really stops because I'm asleep or whatever. Because usually I'm more of a support actor in these kind of things than actually somebody who's a decision maker.
Fair enough.
I'm naturally enjoying other cultures. I actually was a big shortwave radio guy back in the 80s, so kind of getting to see all these cultures is actually a plus for me. I enjoy it. I can tell you some really unusual stories of places I've been, but it is really I do enjoy it. And I think my family enjoys coming with me as well. We also have some per culture teams, like per language email lists and websites and stuff, and that helps too, because we can't expect everybody to sort of know English really well. So so you have there's a huge Russian Telegram channel. I know we have a Spanish email list, and I think a chat, and then some of the conferences, like a German conference, mostly in German. French. We used to have a French mostly conference. I don't think we do that anymore. Chinese, I've seen, and the documentation, of course, is available in a lot of the major languages. And again, it's part of those communities that make that happen.
Hey, Bruce, out of curiosity, when you go multi-language, how do you bring it all back together to understand? So if you've got conversations going on in Chinese and in English.
Somebody will bring the conversation to us. So they'll basically say, on the Ayuda, which means help in Spanish, the Postgres Ayuda channel, we got this question, and one of our bilingual people will ask on our email list, and then we'll reply, and then it will go back that way.
Are engineering discussions always in English then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, the other thing that I was curious about is, if you find that whether it's language barriers, cultural barriers, if you see a lot of disagreements happening between these different communities, and how you kind of manage conflict resolution in such like disparate parts of the world and time. It just sounds so like mind-bogglingly hard.
We really have not had that. I would say that I think the big reason for that is we have sort of a servant leader attitude in our community. So there's not a lot of aggressive pushing of agendas or anything. We're kind of all here together. None of us wrote the software. It came from Berkeley, so we're kind of all there, kind of in the same boat. And the only issue we had recently was obviously the Ukraine war and how do we interact with the Russian community members in that environment. I put out a blog entry about it, basically saying, we don't discriminate against where somebody lives. So just if they happen to live in Russia, that doesn't mean that somehow we're going to be they're less community members. But then we got, that was a little bit of pushback because there's a lot of emotions. A lot of people want us to help Ukraine, and I understand that, but it's hard to say that's something we can effectively do beyond the community that we create. I had to actually present at a Russian conference, and I will be probably in another month. And I basically I said, I know it's a hard time for the Russian people, and I said, but it's an even harder time for the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government. But I said, the project I work for spans, political boundaries, and that's the spirit I'm teaching you today. But I'm also sad that I will not be able to visit you in Russia for perhaps a long time. And I really enjoyed my previous visits, and that's a shame. And they appreciated that. I had to sort of figure out a way of expressing the frustration of the Russians, some of the Russians, especially in the great frustration of Ukraine, and sort of also speaking in a way that was not validating either group, but also trying to say we're here to do something larger. So that was sort of an unusual case I was in where I had to kind of thread the two, but it turned out to be successful. So funding, obviously we don't have any funding, so that's like an easy one. Fortunately, we have a lot of companies that support us, so that's kind of made it easier for us. The development process, again, involve everyone, no matter where they live, right? Find each person's motivator. I talked about that earlier. There are different motivations people have. Figure out what it is, and then help to work. And also, if people have weaknesses, try and avoid those weaknesses from becoming problems. And people will appreciate that you're willing to help them to succeed. That's a big thing, I think, that a lot of people work in nameless jobs and nobody really cares what they do, and they just want them to produce whatever. And if you're willing to invest in people to say, listen, this is a great position, but also there's these limitations, and maybe we should not have you doing this other thing, or maybe we could do it a different way, they appreciate that you're considering that. And also produce work that people are proud of, right? That nobody wants to work something they're embarrassed by. So I think
most people. Maybe there's some people who want to be embarrassed by their work.
Yeah. So you would think so sometimes when you see what people do. But yeah, that's what I think is kind of important.
I think like the finding each other's motivators. I mean, there's a lot of people who really do want to contribute, but they want to be recognized as well. And so that recognition, and even if it's just like thank you, means so much.
Oh yeah. I regularly will email people off list and just say, thanks for this email reply, that you sent. It was really helpful. Just little things. It doesn't. When I spoke at Foster, I said, it doesn't cost you anything to tell somebody you appreciate what they do.
Absolutely.
And it's an incredibly powerful thing, but very few people think that way. They think, like, the example I gave, I said, I travel a lot, and there's a lot of people who make my travel possible, right? All the people who work on the airplane, all the people in the airport, all the people in the hotel, right? Sometimes obviously I'm at the hotel on Sundays. People will probably rather be home, but they're here, right? So I say, thank you for working today. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you helping me get on this flight, right? And they may rather be somewhere else, but they're here helping me. So just things like that are incredibly powerful, but people don't understand that, and they're like, I'm just going to do what I want, and that person, I don't need them anymore, and whatever. And you can be that way. I don't think it's a good way to be, but I think showing people you're appreciative is a key to that, and it's a key to being a servant leader too. It is incredibly motivating, and it's really the right thing to do.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things I learned early on was that having clean code was important because we don't pay people to work on the code, so we got to make it easy. And we do things like we auto indent all the code every year. We rename functions just if it's unclear. We get a patch or two every week just for code comments that are unclear. Like you would think nobody would care, but in fact, people read those comments, and it's part of the reason we're successful, is having code that people can really be proud of and be easy to understand. And I think and the same thing with documentation. That was a big thing for me. Like, let's make this, even small stuff. If somebody's hung up on it, let's fix it. And that culture kind of, once you set that, it kind of flows down, and you don't even have to do anything as a leader because now all your people see the value, and they automatically are doing that, and it's getting taken care of.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. And then finally, again, kind of wrapping it up, lead by example. That's the servant leader style. You can't really lead from authority because you don't have any authority here. You're basically all together. I think, in fact, we've always debated whether hierarchical systems in some way make decision making easier, right? Like if you're a dictatorship, it's very easy to decide we're going to put a road somewhere because you're just going to bulldoze everybody in the way, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is that it demotivates anybody from doing anything. If you've ever studied like dictatorial societies, everyone's looking up to see what they can do or not do, right? And what the government's going to approve or not approve. And those obviously are not using the full skill set of your society because everyone's kind of hampered by what's happening. I have a talk about democracy and databases, which kind of goes into that in more detail. But we're basically about empowering people. We're big about valuing other people's opinions. Accept failure gracefully. I've made mistakes. I said, oh, I'm sorry, I was wrong here. And then when I do that, other people say, oh, I guess I can do that too. I don't have to sort of die or try and fight when I know I've done something wrong. You say, just move on. So we're much more consensus, and aren't really deadline driven. We're much more, when it's done, it's done. When we're proud of it, we think it's ready to go, we're going. And we've had pretty much yearly releases, almost pretty much in the same month for almost a decade now. So the process does work. It's a little slower maybe, but I think it's probably the right thing for us to do. And that is what I had to kind of go over, although, you've obviously added quite a bit as well.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. This all boils down to, really, as you go through, understand the differences and treat people how you want to be treated if you were in their shoes. Right. If you've got someone coming from another culture, you want them to understand your culture. If you have someone who, is, coming into the ecosystem, you want to treat them like you would want to be treated as a team member or as someone working with them. And you're not going to want that extra crap on top. You don't want to get dictated to. You don't want to get, yelled at or put down. You want to be thanked. I think that's where that relationship piece is so important.
Yep.
So, well, Bruce, thank you for the inaugural director's cut.
We did it.
We did it. And we hope that everyone watching likes this and, you appreciate it. And if you have some suggestions on a director's cut of a talk that you would like to see, send it to us. I would love to sit down and have more of these and dig into some of the cool presentations that are out there.
Great.
All right.